I was hired to photograph a wedding at an old countryside estate. It was a historical venue, built sometime in the late 1800s, with tall wooden doors, stone walls, and a large garden out back. The ceremony was set to take place at sunset, with the reception in the ballroom afterward. The couple getting married was Daniel and Evelyn. The guest list was small, maybe 50 or 60 people, mostly family and close friends. The kind of wedding where everything was planned down to the smallest detail. I arrived at noon to take pre-wedding photos. I started with the decorations, the rings, and the venue shots. Then I took photos of Daniel and his groomsmen getting ready in one of the large rooms upstairs. Daniel seemed excited but nervous. I figured that was normal. I had done plenty of weddings before, and grooms always had that same anxious look before the ceremony. He kept checking his watch, asking if everything was on schedule. After that, I went to the bridal suite. Evelyn was sitting in front of a vanity mirror while her makeup artist finished the final touches. Her dress was already on, and the bridesmaids were fixing her veil. She didn't say much, just nodded when I asked if she was ready for photos. I took the standard shots, her looking out the window, her adjusting her dress, the bridesmaids helping her put on her jewelry. She looked calm, just focused. At 6:30, the ceremony started. The guests were seated, the music played, and Daniel stood at the altar. The doors opened, and Evelyn walked down the aisle. I snapped pictures as she made her way to him. The ceremony went smoothly. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. I took pictures of the first kiss, the cheers from the guests, and the couple walking back up the aisle together. Everything was routine, just like any other wedding I had done before. Afterward, I took formal photos, family shots, couple shots, group pictures with the bridesmaids and groomsmen. Evelyn stood right in the center, holding Daniel's hand in every shot. She wasn't much of a talker, only speaking when someone asked her a question. After about 45 minutes we finished, and everyone went inside for the reception. I took my time getting extra photos of the venue before heading in. The sun had set, and the property lights cast long shadows across the garden. That's when I saw someone standing at the altar. It was Evelyn. She was in the same wedding dress, standing completely still, facing away from me. I assumed she had come back out for a moment alone. I raised my camera and took a picture. The flash went off, and the moment my eyes adjusted, she was gone. Looked around. The area was empty. No movement, no sound, just the faint hum of music coming from inside the building. I checked the picture I had just taken. The altar was there, the lights, the decorations, but Evelyn wasn't in it. The spot where she had been standing was empty. I shook it off and headed inside. The reception was already in full swing. Dinner was being served. People were talking, laughing, drinking. I walked around taking pictures of the guests. At one point, Daniel pulled me aside and asked if I could show him the photos so far. I handed him the camera and watched as he flipped. Through them, he stopped at one of the group shots. His expression changed. He looked up at me and asked where Evelyn was. I leaned in and looked at the screen. Everyone was there. The groomsmen, the bridesmaids, the family. But the bride was missing. I frowned and went back through the photos. Every single picture we had taken after the ceremony, she wasn't in them. The couple's shots, the family portraits, the group photos, it was like she had never been there. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. Daniel didn't say anything. He set the camera down and walked away. I watched as he made his way through the crowd, looking around like he was searching for someone. I continued taking photos, but kept checking the pictures after every shot. Evelyn wasn't appearing in any of them. By midnight, the guests started to leave. I packed up my equipment and got ready to head out. Daniel was sitting alone at a table staring at his phone. He hadn't spoken to anyone for over an hour. I considered saying something but decided against it. I loaded my gear into my car and drove home. The next morning I got a call from Daniel. His voice was shaky, like he hadn't slept. He asked me if I had seen Evelyn leave last night. I told him I hadn't. He said she was gone. Not just missing, gone. Her dress was still in the hotel room, her shoes, her phone, everything she had brought with her. But she wasn't there. None of. The guests remembered seeing her leave. Some of them didn't even remember talking to her at the reception. The officiant didn't recall pronouncing them husband and wife. The wedding planner said she had never met the bride in person, only communicated with her through email. Then, Daniel told me to check the guest photos. People had been posting pictures online from the wedding. I pulled up the album, the reception, the ceremony, the group shots. Evelyn was in none of them. Every picture she should have been in was missing. Her entirely. Daniel didn't call me again after that. I tried to reach out a few times, but he never responded. A few weeks later, I looked up the venue online. I found an article about the estate's history. The place had been used for weddings for decades, but there was a story, an old one, about a bride who had disappeared on her wedding night in the early 1900s. The groom searched for her for years, but no trace of her was ever found. Some people believed she had run away. Others thought something had happened to her on the property. A few days later, I went through my memory card again. I checked the photos from before the ceremony. Evelyn was in those. But after that moment, at the altar, after she said "I do," it was like she had never existed at all. I've planned weddings for over a decade. I've dealt with last-minute cancellations, cold feet, even a groom not showing up. But this one still haunts me. I don't talk about it much because most people wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw, and I know what happened. The wedding was set at a secluded estate deep in the woods. It was an old property built in the early 1900s, but recently renovated to host weddings. The couple, Mark and Lillian, wanted an intimate ceremony with close friends and family. About 50 guests, all staying on the property for the weekend. Everything was supposed to be perfect. I arrived 2 days before the wedding to make sure everything was in order. The staff at the venue were friendly but quiet. They didn't speak much unless spoken to. When I asked the property manager about the estate's history, he gave vague answers, brushing off my curiosity. Old buildings have old stories, he said. That was all he told me. The night before the wedding, I did my usual rounds, checking the decorations and finalizing the setup. The ballroom was being prepared for the reception, and the ceremony space was nearly complete. That's when I saw her, Lillian. She was standing in the middle of the aisle, wearing a long white dress. Not her wedding gown, but something older, almost antique looking. Her back was to me, and she wasn't moving. I was about to call out to her when one of the bridesmaids walked in. I glanced at her for just a second, and when I looked back, Lillian was gone. I walked down the aisle, looked around, checked the side doors. Nothing. It was as if she had never been there. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd had long days before, and stress can do weird things to your mind. I went to my room, got some rest, and prepared for the next day. The wedding morning was smooth. Lillian and her bridesmaids were in the bridal suite getting ready. Mark was with his groomsmen. The guests arrived on time, everyone excited. By evening, the ceremony was set to begin. The music played, the guests stood, Mark waited at the altar. The doors opened and Lillian walked in, her wedding gown flowing behind her. I watched as she moved down the aisle, her expression calm, almost too calm. Something about the way she walked felt off. Her movements were slow, deliberate, unnatural. But no one else seemed to notice. The ceremony went on, the vows were spoken. Mark slipped the ring onto Lillian's finger. Then the officiant spoke the words, "You may now kiss the bride." Mark leaned in, but before he could kiss her, the candles around the room flickered. A wind inside the closed venue rushed through. The chandelier above us creaked. The wood beneath, our feet groaned. And then Lillian smiled. Not a normal smile. It stretched too wide, her lips curling in a way that didn't seem human. And then she spoke. Not in her voice. Not in anyone's voice. It was a whisper and a growl at the same time. He is mine now. The moment the words left her mouth, the lights went out. Screams, chairs scraping, people panicking. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Mark was on the floor, gasping for air. The officiant was frozen in place, his face drained of color, and Lillian, she was gone. Not just missing, gone. The dress she had worn was crumpled on the floor, but she was nowhere to be found. The guests ran out. Some searched the grounds, some called the police, but no one could find her. Security checked the cameras, but the footage was useless. It showed the ceremony happening, the guests in their seats, the officiant speaking. But where Lillian should have been, there was nothing. Just an empty space where the bride was supposed to be. The police questioned everyone. No signs of forced entry, no explanation. They took Mark in for questioning, but he had no answers. He kept repeating one thing over and over again. She said she would come back. Days turned into weeks, and Lillian was never found. No body, no clues. It was as if she had never existed. The wedding guests stopped talking about it. The venue shut down a few months later. I stopped planning weddings for a while. Then, about a year later, I got a call from an unknown number. I picked up expecting a spam call, but instead I heard a voice. Soft, whispering, familiar. "I told you, he is mine." And then the call ended. I never heard from that number again. I don't plan weddings anymore. I've worked in event planning for years. I've handled all kinds of situations. Last-minute cancellations, drunk guests, fights breaking out at receptions. But nothing prepared me for what happened at the Carter wedding. The venue was a historic mansion that had been converted into an event space. It was the kind of place that had a long driveway, marble floors, and old paintings on the walls. The wedding was set for late evening, with about 100 guests attending. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. I arrived early to make sure everything was running smoothly. The staff was setting up the chairs, the catering team was preparing the food, and the florist was arranging the last of the centerpieces. The bride, Emily, was in the bridal suite, and the groom, James, was with his groomsmen. Everything was on schedule. The ceremony started at 7 p.m. The guests were seated, the music played, and Emily walked down the aisle. Everything went as planned. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and the couple was pronounced husband and wife. After that, everyone moved into the main hall for the reception. Dinner was served, drinks were flowing, and people were having a good time. As I walked around, checking on things, I noticed someone standing near the back of the room. A woman in a dark dress. I assumed she was a guest, though something about her seemed off. She wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't eating or drinking, just standing there, watching. At one point, I asked one of the staff members if they knew who she was. They didn't. I figured she was a +1 that no one had mentioned, so I let it go. Weddings always had extra guests who slipped in unnoticed. Then the speeches started. The best man spoke, followed by the maid of honor. Guests laughed, clapped, cheered. I scanned the room again, and that's when I realized the woman was gone. I didn't see her leave, and I didn't remember her moving. I went to check with security. They had been monitoring the entrance all night. When I asked if they had seen a woman in a dark dress arrive or leave, they looked at me confused. They hadn't let anyone in who wasn't on the guest list. I asked if they could check. The cameras, the footage showed the reception hall. Guests mingling, dancing, eating. But where I had seen the woman, there was no one. Just an empty space near the back of the room. I replayed the footage several times. The guests around her were acting normal, like nothing was strange. But there was no one there. I didn't say anything. I just went back to the reception, finished my work, and made sure everything ended smoothly. By midnight, most of the guests had left, and I stayed behind to oversee cleanup. As I walked through the now empty hall, I glanced over at the spot where I had seen the woman standing. I don't know why, but I took out my phone and snapped a quick picture. When I looked at the photo, the room was empty, but in the reflection of one of the windows, there she was, standing exactly where I had seen her earlier. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to be the guy spreading weird stories about a wedding. But I never worked at that venue again. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun.